I'm sorry, but I'm glad to see you all. So we won't have a treasurer's report tonight. The only thing is, we did get a new, excuse me, did the CD over, and we took the interest and put it on the savings account. So it's back to $2,500.
What type of term did you want the CD in for? A year?
Sylvia, what was the how long was the CD?
12 months.
She can get it to you if she doesn't remember.
I'm not positive about it.
So, without further ado, I know everybody's anxious to excuse me, get on with the program. I think it's going to be an exciting program. I've been down to the dig and I've been fascinated with it. So I will introduce Dr. Richard Bovis. Over. State Archaeologist, New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources, and the Department of Cultural Resources.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to give a short presentation this evening, and I see an awful lot of familiar faces here. Some I've seen just earlier today. Others, old friends of mine I've known for many years. Nancy Lyons, who's worked with me from the Native community. It's important to know that archaeologists are people who study the past, but the past is not dead. It lives on today. It lives on through the work that we do, and it lives on through the collective memory of the people who created that past. And it's a kind of honor to be able to investigate the past, to bring it to light, to give it to the public, and in many cases there are people who have an ancestry that go back to that. And I think it's refreshing to see that we're able to communicate and share communication back and forth between the archaeologists and the Native community. So, with that, I'm going to give you a brief presentation. I realize that it's a little stuffy, and I have my own supply of hot air. And I'll try to keep it down to a minimum. What I'm going to do is give you a brief summary of what we have done and a little bit of what we've learned over the past 6 weeks. And one other thing I'd like to mention, I have an interesting connection with the town of Colebrook that goes back well before I was born. The town of Colebrook, as many of you know, was the source of the colony that founded Beloit, Wisconsin. And my wife and I both graduated from Beloit, and we even have another Beloit student with us. And I found it kind of interesting when I went to college here to find out that the town had been founded from a New Hampshire place, and now I find myself working there. So, with that, I'm going to go into the presentation, and I'll go through it quickly, and then I'd be very happy to take questions. I try to have my presentations skewed towards telling you things that you want to hear as opposed to what I think you want to hear. And can you hear me well enough as it is?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. 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 My presentation is a day in the life. Recent research in the Colebrook Paleo-Indian site. And the reason why I call it day in life will become obvious in a few minutes. Our archaeological field school will end tomorrow. We've been preparing for it for over a year. It takes me more time to prepare for this than it does to execute it, and I assure you executing is much more fun. And here you can see the location of where we've been working, and mostly right in this area right here, but actually all along this pasture by the Connecticut River. I'm going to talk this evening a great deal about a certain kind of spear point. The archaeologists call them fluted points. And to a normal person, a flute is a musical instrument. For the archaeologist, a fluted point is a point with a channel that runs up and down. You may know that some Greek columns, for instance, have flutes on them, as those grooves that run up and down. Well, that's the term that we borrowed for this. And you have a spear point, and it has this long groove that runs up, usually both sides, and that is the distinctive hallmark for the Paleo-Indian period. That period is roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. That's the only time that people made spear points with this specific kind of groove running up the middle. And that makes it really, really convenient for the archaeologists, because anytime you find one of these, you know that it's at least 10,000 years old. And what's also rather interesting, it's the flakes that make them. Now, the points are hard to find. because people would use them, they would break and become unrecognizable. But when they made them, they had to drive off that flake that made that groove up the middle. And if you know what to look for, you can see the remnants of the original shape. And it's actually possible for us to find flakes that could only have come from making that groove. Well, for us, that is just as diagnostic, just as indicative of the time and the type as the point itself. So this makes it even more possible to identify the sites, which we'll discuss later this evening why it's so important here. But these channel flakes, or fluting flakes, are a key identifier for this extremely old time period. Now let's just look at the land for just a little bit. You can see here an aerial photograph of your town and the Connecticut River as it winds through it. And it makes this big bend right through here that comes down. And where we've been working is going to be right in here. So you can see that we're on the floodplain of the ancient Connecticut River. Not the current floodplain, but long ago it was the floodplain. The reason why we are here at all is because Edna Feitner, who works with me in our office, was the leader of the archaeological team that did the survey in advance of the construction of the gas pipeline. It was their job to follow that entire route through New Hampshire and to identify the archaeological sites that might be in the path of that pipeline. Her crew came in, dug 200 plus small pits. We call them shovel test pits. They're about the size of a large wastebasket and a little deeper. This was taken this summer, by the way. And she came through and identified a number of artifacts in the pasture, including some ones that caused us to come back. And here you can see a just quick distribution map of where she dug all those pits, and in some places they dug larger pits to investigate interesting finds. And this is laid over a property map, and you can see it has a railroad bed, this is the Connecticut River up here, and various hot spots where things were found. This is the one that is of most interest to us. But we have to recognize it wasn't just the 10,000-year-old site that was present. In part of the field, there was a quartzite spear point. We call it a Neville-like point, named after points that were found in Manchester, New Hampshire. And it would be along the order of 5,000 or 6,000 years old. Very old, no doubt about that. But we have things even older. What she found that made the site so important were these channel flakes. And you can see here a group of them. And to the practiced eye, we can see that there are flakes that came in from both sides that were along the middle of this long spear point before they took the flake off. And then it was knocked off and you have this flake left over. Here's one where they struck it, and it's rather long. This would be about 2 inches long. This is, of course, a little bit shorter. We're often asked as archaeologists, what can you possibly learn from those chips of stone? It's an excellent question. What we can learn from the chips of stone depends upon the questions that we ask of the stone. And we ask, how is this made? What did it come from? Where did the stone come from that they used to make the spear point? Asking those questions leads us to recognize that the stone had to come from a great distance away, because we do not have stone like this. This is a flint. We do not have it in New Hampshire or any place nearby in Vermont. It's that distinctive shape that comes from making these fluted points. That led us to believe that it's a very important place. So important that they made the pipeline go around it. This is an aerial photograph. It's taken from a pulse color infrared, so it really is not that bright. But because of the nature of the photography, it makes it stand out. And so this is a totally different temperature as well as color from the surrounding land. And you can see the pipeline coming about. Oops, here's the Paleoindian site. Let's go down around here. Oh, we're home free now. That was done because it was cheaper for the gas pipeline company to go around the site than to destroy it. Okay, let's move on to the present day. The pipeline work was done in 1997, and now almost 10 years later, we're back out in the field. And here's a photograph of Dawn Lastman. She's my field assistant who's helping myself and Edna. Edna is the co-principal investigator for our field school. And Dawn is the one that keeps us all in line and keeps track of all the paperwork, which is, by the way, the hardest job out there. Trust me. The work that we did falls into three fundamental kinds of work. And we did all three on this project. The three kinds of work are discovery, evaluation as to how important something is, and then the full research. The discovery phase is really very simple. You go out and you dig a lot of little square holes in straight lines in a rigorous fashion across the countryside. And here you see two of our crew, Megan Thomas from Burlington, Vermont, and Richard Shurin, who has got his nose down to the ground. He's here with us today, excavating one of these shovel test pits. And it's seemingly a simple matter, but not really, to dig down in measured amounts through the ground, transferring up into one of these sifters, and then removing the soil to find the artifacts. And if you've done the job right, you get one of these. This is a metric system here, and it shows that it's just over 3 foot deep. It's a meter deep. So this is one of our holes finished. It's actually a little deeper than average. We would dig them down to about 60 centimeters, or about 2 feet below the ground surface. So this is what you get when you excavate them. And it proves that you can dig a square hole with a round shovel, although the square shovels come out on occasion. So this is how we discover where things are located in a general sense across the site. It's simple prospecting. And you have some luck sometimes. One of the more interesting artifacts that we found is not terribly old. This is probably only about 250 years old. It's a broken portion of a gun flint, probably from a musket. It was found out in the pasture as part of our systematic surveying, and actually was found in a place where people had occupied it probably about 5,000 years ago as well. There was a small collection of quartz tools, including some scrapers, that we're pretty sure are about 5,000 to 6,000 years old, and right with them was a gun flint. And I think it was there because of the same reason people were there 5,000 years ago. It was a good place to see up and down the valley. It was a good place for hunters to sit and wait. Some things really don't change a whole lot over the years. Once we dig the shovel test pits, we dig the larger 1 meter squares to more intensively investigate and determine, is something significant or not? Right here was a place where we found a small tool, a black flint scraper, and we wanted to determine, was there more to go with it? So we excavated these large squares right here, found essentially nothing. I'm still puzzled as to why we only found that one artifact. The artifact itself, black chert scraper right here, is distinctive in its own right. It is actually a broken tip of the spear point that was then re-chipped into a scraper. And this particular practice of making these broken tips into scrapers and using flint or chert to do it is something that we associate with culture at about 2,000 years ago. This is the time when people are beginning to make a lot of pottery. They're starting to garden. It's an interesting time frame in the past because it's a time of great change. We thought, well, we might have this component here that relates to that time of change with the pottery and the agriculture and so forth. And I think we must have spent a week excavating those 3 squares right by it. Didn't find anything else. I have no explanation as to why we only found that one artifact all by itself. I can only suppose that someone simply lost it as they're traveling across the countryside. And we got lucky. Well, we found some other things in the 1 meter squares as well. A lot of what we find are not direct artifacts, but changes made in the soil by people. We call them features, for lack of a better term. You can see very clearly one right here, another one here. And this one got our interest too. And these are probably places where stakes were driven into the ground. They then rotted away, filled in with darker soil, and left this stain behind. As I said, we call them features. And they were located in 1 meter square relatively close to the Paleo-Indian concentration. Now, I don't know for certain that they're associated with that or not. We did not find any artifacts in this pit to go with it. It may have been a little piece of quartz at the top, I don't recall exactly, but essentially nothing was with this. But it was about 6 meters or about 20 feet away from our concentration. It could be coincidental, probably not. One of the questions that we came to answer, and this would be the third phase of research, is what was going on with the original encampment? When the work was done by Edna and her crew in 1997, they dug several of these 50-centimeter, foot-and-a-half square holes in an alignment through here, discovered some flint, discovered suggestions they had a very old site. They then excavated a square that was 1 meter by 2 meters, or a little more than 3 foot by about 6.5 foot. They dug it down. When they excavated down about this far, they encountered the edge of the fireplace, more of these stakes that were driven in the ground that rotted away, and a good number of those channel flakes. You recall I showed you 3 of them at the beginning of these very distinctive channel flakes that could only have come from these spear points. We had just a small peek at the site. It's as though you had about 5 or 6 pieces of the jigsaw puzzle fit together in the middle and 2 or 3 others scattered out around them. You have an idea of what's there. There's some leaves, maybe a bit of water, but what is it? So we wanted to find out just what it is. So we went in, stripped off the side, which is still piled up in the wall, put it back tomorrow, and proceeded to excavate down into the soil. We started off with a 4 meter by 4 meter square. Cleared it off, shoveled out by skimming all of the upper soil that had been plowed, all churned together, and whatever is there will be next. We would find little bits of flint that were probably 10,000 years old in the same handful as a bit of old crockery, a bit of glass, square cut nails, things that have been blurred together over time. So we laid it out in the grid, proceeded to excavate down, knowing that there was something further down. You look very carefully, you can see right here a lightish patch. And this is the location of that original 1 by 2 meter square. We were actually able to come out before the field school started, walk through the field, and by taking distances from the utility poles and digging a little bit in the ground to get the exact location of that 1 by 2 meter square. And we tried to replicate the original grid system that Edna had put down. We came within this much, about 6 inches offset east-west and about 5 or 6 inches north-south, which we think is pretty good. We were able to then use the grid system that Edna set up to carry on our investigations so we can join together her research in '97 with our research today. We've had a long-standing relationship with archaeologists from the province of Quebec. And we have been working with them since 1994. And crews from Quebec will come down and work with us. We will go up and work with them in a true cultural exchange. And Claude Chapdelain from the University of Montreal came down and joined us, brought down 14 of his crew members, added to 14 of ours, and we proceeded to do an expansion of the area. We had already expanded an additional meter one direction, then we went another meter the other direction, creating a 5 by 5 meter square. And here you see both of our crews working together, sifting and digging and going further over there. Here you can see as we proceeded down through the deposits, this is our combined crews working together. And when we excavate these 1 meter squares, we do it in quadrants. So there are 4 sections to each 1 meter square, and we keep track of what we find by those sections. And I told them to get in, dig with a trowel, and do it in diagonal squares, and they did it perfectly. It looks very nice. It's a true checkerboard. And this shows how we are working on the site, and that's our typical method of excavation as we get down deeper into the deposits. The upper plow zone we skim away with a shovel, then we turn with a trowel. And here you see the combined crew at the end of the day. And you can see we have quite a diversity of people on our crew. Canadians are mostly over here. We have people from the community. We have people from Idaho and people in between. So this shows you members of our crew here, and it's colorful to say the least. Now let's talk about some of the things that we found. As we went down into the deposits, after about 3 or 4 days of digging, we started to hit some very dense concentrations of artifacts. And what we found were fundamentally just two kinds of artifacts: ordinary chipping debris and channel flakes. We've spent 9 days excavating in this one hole, and we've yet to find a single finished tool. 2 of the channel flakes look like they might have been used for cutting something, but it's kind of iffy. But here you see one of these channel flakes, and it's got the flakes that come in from one side, flakes that come in from the other, and it's knocked off this way. We have found, so far, 24 of these, at least. We have to go back through our collections to check them one more time, but we have been producing them in great numbers in very small areas in the site. Here's a classic channel flake right here. It was peeled off of the top side of the spear point. This one is even more interesting. It's a channel flake with a channel in it. It had one of these flakes peeled off right up the middle, and then they went back and did it again. Now bear in mind, they have a piece of stone that is really more like glass than anything else. It's hard, but it's brittle. You can chip it, but it can fly apart very easily if you don't do it right. Knocking off one of these long, thin flakes to make that groove is a real challenge. Knocking off 2 in a row, one on top of the other, seems like you're really pushing the wire. But this is what they did. And we have several examples like this one. I said earlier that what you learn from the little chips of stone depends on what kinds of questions that you ask. And one of the questions that we ask is, where did the stone come from? And in Munsungan, Maine, which is northern Maine, I'll show you a map in a moment, they have these wonderful cherts or flints that are found in enormous quantities. I've been there, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of quarry pits that have been chipped into the hillsides where people were mining the stone out. And it comes in quite a variety of colors. There's a nice red with a blue in it, a green variety, and a black variety, nearly black, with gray bands. And after looking at some of these very, very closely, it's clear to me that at least some of the black flint that we've been finding has come from Munsungan, Maine. It is identical to this particular sub-variety of chert. To put this in some sort of perspective, here you are, here's Munsungan, Maine. It's further away than Boston. Someone managed to carry stone tools, either on foot or by canoe, all the way from here through here. And in fact, in this particular map are abbreviations for a variety of other archaeological sites of this time period that have this Munsungan chert, and actually cherts from Berlin, New Hampshire, that have been found mixed in their components. So what we have here is evidence for linkage between people here and here and here, all the way down to here. And this shows that people were ranging widely all over New England and southern Quebec. Claude Chapdelaine has discovered the one and only Paleo-Indian site in Quebec, Fluted Point Paleo-Indian site, here at Lake Gigantic, not terribly far from New Hampshire and Maine. Maine's there, Fluted New Hampshire's there. So what do we have here? We have a place where people camped. We worked all around this one spot where the original find was made. And we spent weeks digging these prospecting holes, finding effectively nothing, which is very disappointing at the time. But what it tells us is that the area where the Paleo-Indian encampment is located was a very small one. Very small. We're talking about something that is probably along the order of, at most, 30 feet across, more likely smaller. And the heart of it is the size of a small kitchen. not as small as the kitchen that we feed 18 people out of at Coleman State Park, but small. The site is small. It exhibits only the debris from making spear points. There are no scrapers. There are no cutting tools. In fact, there are no spear points, at least not yet. I'm frankly very surprised that we do not have any of these tools. And there's other more rare varieties of special boring and cutting tools and grading tools and so forth. We found none of these. And these are commonly found in other sites. And we have probably collected along the order of about 2,000 or 3,000 chips of stone so far, which is actually a rather large number for a site of this age. But there are no tools. There are the remains of making tools, but only one kind of tool, a spear point. Also, we have the hearth, from which we obtained a date of about between 10,500 and 11,000 years ago in real time. And those stake holes in the ground. What we interpret from that at this point in time was an occupation that was very focused. Very limited range of activities can be documented there. Notice I hedged my bet. I said can be documented. There may have been plenty of other things going on there. They could have been making basketry at a factory level for all I know. But we have no evidence for that because that would never survive the 10,000 plus years. What we have evidence for is just the making of these spear points and only the end stages. We've got just the tiniest flakes. When I say tiny, I mean some of them are the size of the head of a pin. It's a credit to the students that they can find these things, particularly when it's really hot, really humid. We've seen in the last few weeks. Sometimes we get a little rain in the middle of the night with some wind. Yeah, anyway. So what we have evidence for is a day in the life of a few tool makers. We have maybe 4 kinds of stone that we use there. They make at least 4 tools, probably 6, 7, or 8 on the low side. They're only making one kind of tool, a hunting spear point. That's all we can say. The other thing that we have learned is that this is in an ancient river floodplain. Today, that area does not flood because it's 20 feet higher than the current elevation of the Connecticut River. We brought in an individual who's very good at mapping. He mapped it very carefully. We're 20 feet higher. And it takes an awful lot of water to come up 20 feet in the Connecticut River, at least up here. At the time that this site was occupied, the Connecticut River itself was much higher. Glacial Lake Colebrook had once completely covered the valley with sands, which were then washed away by the Connecticut River. Then, of course, in the early years, the Connecticut River was higher, and it cut its way down through the sands to create the modern floodplain. On its way down, it was able to flood where we were. In so doing, it captured in place all the things that we found. They were buried by floods. There's only one other group of sites in all of New England that can be clearly associated with a river. And those are sites over on the Galloway in Maine. And they were discovered when a dam that had been built had been opened to do some maintenance work. You discover these sites because they'd washed away all the topsoil. You could find the artifacts lying on the ground along the edge of the river, the ancient. Here we have a case where we have the artifacts buried in the floodplain of that ancient river. That gives us a chance to see things in context. At those sites, they found a wealth of stone tools, but they didn't find any hearths. They didn't find any molds of stakes driven in the ground. That's what we have to offer. Now, we're going to spend a great deal of time looking at what we found very carefully, looking at all the subtle indications that we dug up, that we mapped in place in the ground. We've taken many soil samples, many samples of carbon for dating and so forth. We have an awful lot of work to do. It will take much longer to understand this site than it takes to dig it. In many ways, it's harder work. But that's what we're going to do. At this point, we have at least a day in the life of probably 2 or 3 tool makers who are probably getting ready to back out of it. Doesn't sound like much, but then again, to be able to speak confidently about what some people did more than 10,000 years ago is something of an achievement, at least in my opinion. So, with that, we end our discussion and have a look at a wonderful photograph moving across the site taken by Laura Jefferson. She took that a few days ago. And it's a beautiful place, and we enjoy working. That's what I have to say, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So does anyone have any questions to ask him?
Yeah, the spear point that you showed to begin with, that was just to show an example.
Yes, yes. That spear point was found in 1884 in Conway, New Hampshire, a place called Intervale. If you ever driven Route 16, there's a large rest stop, public facility there. And as near as we can determine, it's found very near there. And this fellow was an artist. He had his own car and gave his name, and his name was Ewing. And said the painter, oils and pastels will do pencil sketches. And I think he was an aspiring artist. At that time period, the grand hotels would have resident artists to make paintings of the beautiful landscape to sell patrons. That's what I think he was doing. It was donated to the Smithsonian in 1888, and we kept track of it ever since. And I was able to borrow it back from the Smithsonian and make casts of it. And that was actually a cast of the point that I show there. And so it's an example of the style. And I'm very convinced that what we're finding is the same style of point, the same time period as that Intervale point, which would be not the beginning of the Paleo-Indian, not the end, right down the middle. Yes?
My husband and I own the farm just above where you got, where the electric convention or station is.
Only vaguely, to be honest.
You know, the girls' store is?
Yep.
Just above there.
Uh-huh.
And the road to our meadow is just above there. It's down into the Meadow River.
Mhm.
And one time when my husband was plowing, he came across this big circle of stones, and they were all kind of reddish. So Dr. Gifford used to be was interested in archaeology, so I took one of the stones to him, and he said, well, show me where you found it. So by the time I got back, my husband carried it over, we never could find it. But it was all, it's all loam there.
Mhm.
It was just a big pile.
Yeah. It could have been one of many things. One of the more interesting features like that we have documented in other places are what we interpret as fish roasting platforms, where you have a pavement of rock, which you described as, sounds pretty close to it, where you would build just a rip-roaring fire, and then you pull it back and slap those fish right down on there and grill them. And they have been documented on the Merrimack River, and it's no surprise to me at all that you might be on the Connecticut.
Down, pretty deep, and
Yeah.
it was kind of reddish, the stone.
Good fire will do that, and with flooding over the years, you'll have this accumulation. And in the 19th century, the logging had created such a problem with erosion that you can get 3 or 4 feet of sediment being brought in by the floods. They'll cap over the old farmers' fields. I excavated one site. We brought in heavy equipment, peeled off the top 3 feet, and we're finding plow scars and early 20th century bottle glass at the bottom. And then from there, of course, we cleaned it up and done our site. But you can get tremendous buildup of the sediments, particularly in the 19th century. I think it's a real testimony to the modern forestry practices that we now have forestry using the forest much better, and we do not have the erosion problems that occurred 100 years ago or more. People sometimes get rather cranky at forestry, but they have no appreciation for how much it's improved over the years. And I've excavated several places where we can document a tremendous amount of erosion, and modern day, it just doesn't happen. There may be some places a problem, I won't argue with that, but contemporary forestry is so much better than it was in the 19th century. So that deeply buried feature that your husband found could easily have been on the surface 200 years ago. It could have been a fish roasting platform only 300 years old. As far as I'm concerned, 300 years is a lot. But it could be quite ancient, it could be very old, without having had a look at it ourselves, and it's hard to tell.
How deep was the glacier here at its
Oh, that's a good, I don't know. I know that the glacial lake here was, basically, the surface of the glacial lake was right at the peak of the municipal swimming pool. We had the geologists out there earlier this season. They came out and they said that the surface of glacial Lake Colebrook was at a particular elevation, and is the hillside right next to the swimming pool. And so the roof of the swimming pool would have been right about the water level of the glacial lake. Now the glacier itself was much thicker. When it was here, it could have been, half a mile above it. That's very hard to estimate. And that's a question for a geologist. I get information from the geologist, but it's only like secondhand at best.
An example, back when this was potato country,
Yes.
they used to drive logs down the Mohawk. Because on the flatland, cleared with no trees,
Yeah.
you had a heavier water level.
Uh-huh.
But once they were back to trees,
Yeah.
they absorbed the runoff was in trees that they used to run logs right down the Mohawk. But the question, were you part of that dig up at Canaan, how many years ago?
No, I wasn't, but I have colleagues who were there. Yes.
Did they find anything much of interest?
Yes, they found basically one of these middle woodland campsites that I talked about 2,000 years old. They found a fairly substantial campsite, not quite a village, that dates to that time period of great change. And colleagues of mine worked there. They did an extensive excavation. It's interesting because New Hampshire, in its wisdom, decided they want all the Connecticut River. They get all the bridges across the river. And so New Hampshire paid for the bridge and all the archaeology before the bridge was rebuilt, including the archaeology on the Vermont side. So we have New Hampshire Department of Transportation funding an excavation in Vermont. Itself. Yes, yes, colleagues. Yes.
Do most of the finds that you have come along river passageways or waterways as far as Indian civilizations are concerned, or do you find some of those remotely from
Sort of. There's certainly a lot of sites found on the riverbanks. And that has as much to do with how sites are preserved in place as it has to do with where people live. If they're living on the side of a hill or a hilltop and that erodes, say, the forestry practices from 150 years ago, it's gone. If, however, it's in a place where it's capped over, it'll be preserved. So we do find quite a few that are located along the water courses. But we also find them associated with, say, swamps, wetlands. While they may not be particularly attractive to us today, they were a wealth of resources in terms of not only animals, for plants, for food, for basketry, for dyes, for medicine, for all sorts of things. So we find, near to certain kinds of bodies of water, including wetlands, archaeological sites. Of course, they go to where the stone is good to make the tools to get those. And that can be, almost any, it's not going to be almost any place, but you'll find these outcrops sort of independent of water. And Mount Jasper in Berlin is an excellent example of that. People had to have water, but we have to remember that springs that were present 3,000 years ago may not be present today. So the sources of water that people might have used may no longer be available to us today. So the answer is yes, sort of, but there are plenty of sites that are nowhere near any sort of identifiable water source that people could have used. There will be variations along the line.
I have a couple of questions. The area that you dug in the pictures, how do you know to dig right there? How do you know that that wasn't just a few people, but the rest of the people were like 20 feet away?
Because we dig a lot of holes in a regular fashion, pounding away. It's sort of like playing Battleship. You just keep
Doesn't
throwing.
that drive you crazy to think that maybe 3 feet over?
Archaeologists are not normal people.
Are you coming back to dig more, or is this it?
Probably not. Probably not, because we have learned a great deal from the site. We want to put it on the National Register of Historic Places, which is part of the reason why we worked here. This stuff left, but it needs to be left in place because Edna looked at it almost 10 years ago. We came back with better questions to look at it today. 20 years from now, they may be able to look at that site without digging it and learn things because of the increase in remote sensing, the capabilities to look under the ground without having to dig, which to the contemporary archaeologists is really a horrible thought. But really it's better for the site. We like to dig, let's face it. But there are other questions that can be answered in the future with better techniques. And as we go further into our capabilities, they'll be less and less destructive. It means that we can look at them again and again and again. Yes?
If that site is going to go on the National Register, is there something that this town should do to make it interesting for people who might want to visit?
Well, that really is a question as much for the landowners as it is for me. We're there at the very good graces of the Gadwahs, and very, very thankful for their hospitality. The National Register listing only, restricts it, if you will, from federal actions. People can do what they want on their own property. And how much is made of the site really is, in my mind, much more of an issue for the owners. They're the ones that you put the question to eventually. And you asked that question at a good point. I would like to have it come up here because I've got something I'd like to give to Neil and Brenda. Come up here, please. In today's world, nothing is really real until it has a T-shirt. We have over here on this gentleman the T-shirt from our excavation last year. Now, we were working in a residential neighborhood in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm not going to ever do that again. And we had our own symbol in it that reads, asking the questions, why did archaeologists cross the road? I think it's illegal to have a road race in modern America unless you have a T-shirt to go with it. I think this probably state regulations is illegal to have it without a T-shirt. Okay? So anyway, what we have here are T-shirts that show them something that they probably see almost every day, and that's Knock Mountain. And this is our official Hill School T-shirt, and I want to give you each your own shirt.
Thank you.
Brenda and Neil get that.
Scrap means... Oh, I'm sorry. The second rule is that you have to have a photograph taken of these things.
With the T-shirt?
Yes, just come out and
Okay.
that'll
Wear
look good.
Okay.
And
Put
smile.
it on, Brenda. Put it on.
Okay, one more and I'm done.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, this
Okay, that's
is
your
right
last
away. I apologize. Let's see, might have a cosmic thing.
Now, you realize, Brenda, the museum doesn't have one of those yet.
We have them printed right here in town at Vascular Stitches. They did a wonderful job on short notice. Give you exactly what you want. You need a T-shirt, you go to them. Pardon me? Oh, scrap. It's our acronym for the State Conservation and Rescue Archaeology Program. And it's been named that for, since about 1982 or something like that. Scrap was an ongoing operation before I went to work for the state of New Hampshire in 1987. And that's the acronym that we use. And it's a program that's designed to take members of the public and show them how to do archaeology, how to do it properly, how to do it ethically. And it's really public archaeology in the best sense of the word. And it's not just a matter of luring people in from across the country to come dig for us for free. Actually, charging a little bit. But they get involved in doing the research, doing the laboratory work, and I've had scrap volunteers end up publishing papers in professional journals, and many have gone on to college, on to graduate school, and are professional archaeologists. Some people come in and learn how to do it and decide they want to become an archaeological field technician. They usually call themselves shovel folks. And these are the people who and are basically the on-the-ground people who do the environmental impact archaeology that's done across the country. I don't try to have a program that trains people to become professional archaeologists. I have a program that trains people to do public archaeology. Sometimes they go on and do it professionally, they do it for a few years, do it for a career, whatever. But it's our way of getting people involved in the archaeology. And one of the interesting side benefits of doing this is that having trained people from the communities, they then can speak to those issues in their own community. If I come in to tell you, you should build such and such on this property because it's got a site X number of years old, that's all very nice, but who am I? I'm just some expert from out of town, what do I know? But when somebody from the community says, you know, I worked on a site like that a few years ago, and this is why that site is important. That person from the community speaking to the issue of why historic preservation is important is far more persuasive than I could ever be. And so it's not just a matter of doing the research, but getting our message out as to why sites are important, why they should be treated with care and respect, why they should be conserved.
I got a question for me. Obviously, when the pipeline went through many years ago, it was a major excavation in a large part of the state. So obviously, the state, became involved in that, looking as far as any sites. Beyond a project of that scope, what other type of projects do you take on? Is it somebody like saying from the community that comes up and says, I have a site that may be an issue? Or, I mean, do you have a watchdog?
We sort of divided into two camps. There are situations where an organization is required by state or federal regulations, they have to do an investigation. It could be a highway, it could be a sewage treatment plant, it could be a Corps of Engineers permit for a boat ramp, anything like that. And they're required to do that. And they go out and they hire the professional archaeologists who get their field technicians and so forth to do that work. There's also situations where someone is doing private development, or we anticipate that in a given area there will be a lot of development. We will go to the landowners and say, can we have your permission to go and look here and learn what we can before it gets developed? And I've even gone to developers. Not every developer has horns and hooves and eats babies for breakfast. A lot of developers are good citizens who have a concern for history in the past and are willing to work with us. And I've worked on a number of projects where we have worked with the developer, with the real estate people, gone in, done the work, found out a great deal about the sites, and then they come in and they build what they're going to build anyway. And they've even changed their schedules of construction sometimes, usually because they haven't complicated funding, but they have worked with us. I've even had developers say, you can go out and work the site, but don't you dare tell anybody that you're there. Don't you tell them I gave permission. They think any publicity is bad publicity. Don't associate my name with this good work you're doing. That says something about their own personal interaction with the public. But I've had more than one occasion where they said, yes, you can do it, but please don't tell anybody that you're there until it's gone. Okay, it's fine with me. And so we have situations where we come in where we are concerned that something's going to be lost. We worked at a site in North Haverhill, New Hampshire, that was eroding away in the Connecticut River. We're concerned that it was going to be lost. We did work there, made some very important finds, and 2 years later, most of the site's gone to erosion. Another time, there was a case of advanced private housing development. It varies. So there are occasions where usually it's federal involvement that requires that it be done by federal standards. There's other times when I take and use the scrap organization to go out to places where either it's something very important that we really need to know about it, or it may be lost to develop in the future. The site we worked this summer is not in any threat to destruction, but it holds the potential to answer some really, really important questions. So we went and looked around it and took a little bit more of a bite out of it to see what we could find out, and I believe we've learned a great deal from it.
So beyond that, I'm sorry, just to follow up on the question. So in New Hampshire, really, if it's not, you're talking about the road project, you're talking really there's public money involved, where there's non-public money like private development, there's really nothing on the books, unless you had something or somebody's got some information that...
Well, generally, if it's private development, it does not require certain kinds of permits. A wetlands permit, for instance, is a trigger. So if you're totally private money, but if it needs a wetlands permit, then you get involved in it. And in fact, that's what Edna does on a day-to-day basis. She's in charge of the review and compliance in New Hampshire.
And actually, to address that, I've come up in the past few years to Colebrook itself, when you have monies that you take from the USDA, NRCS,
anytime you get like your wells that you had drilled up here, you wanted to investigate areas, we knew that was sensitive, but I didn't know exactly where. I dealt with your town offices, came up here and helped out Colebrook. But with, yes, private development, it's not the responsibility of the state, it's the responsibility of the developer. And actually, that's part of one of the issues that everybody in town should be aware of, that if any development project or town project needs some sort of federal permit, uses some sort of federal funding, or uses some sort of federal license, they have to have some sort of coordination with the Division of Historical Resources. We literally provide review and guidance if anybody is doing any sort of project. So we'll say, oh yes, that's sensitive, you need to hire a consultant. So that's part of kind of in your town planning that you really need to be aware of. There are areas here in Colebrook that are extremely sensitive. So when that happens, those of you who are in, any sort of your town business, really be aware and ask if they've had any sort of wetland permits. Ask them for letters from the Division of Historical Resources to say, oh, there's nothing there, or yes, you should be aware there's something there. So just to take back to the planners.
Your question?
Yes.
What's eventually going to happen to the artifacts that you found here? Where are they going to be housed?
They're going to be housed in Concord. We have a curation facility down there. We're going to do, of course, a lot of research and photography and so forth. 99.9% of what we find is of no interest to any reasonable person. Just archaeologists. Trust me. As I said, we have no tools. We just have the templates. Yes.
But Dick, you did tell us that you were going to make casts
Yes.
of everything you found so that we could show people
Right.
more, have them for.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And then so the casts come back
Yes.
here, but
The artifacts themselves
Yeah.
are going to be given.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
How do you secure your funding?
creatively. But some of the funding, my salary is paid in part by the Historic Preservation Fund, which, by the way, is not taxpayer money. Money from offshore oil and gas investigations goes into the Land and Water Conservation Fund and Historic Preservation Fund. That is the source of the federal pot of money. It's matched by the state of New Hampshire. The match comes in terms of cash that they may pay for part of our salary, rent for our buildings, that sort of thing. It also comes from donations and in-kind donations. Sometimes people give us money. Nice, we like that. And then the time put in by the volunteers is actually used as match against the federal grant. It's an in-kind kind of thing. So we keep track of the time people put in. We harass people at the end of the day to fill out their time sheets, and then that's put into a calculation to show our offset from the federal money. But mostly it's through donations, and we carve out little bits from our state budget. If you're from New Hampshire, you know that the state budgets are not overly fat. So it's a matter of getting a little out of the state budget, getting some federal money, and working with the public.
Any more questions? Thank you.
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. I apologize again for, we accept donations.
You have a beautiful historical society building here. Donations.